Here is how we can edit these soft, dreamy waterfall images in Lightroom. So if you want to follow along, you can find a link to download this raw file in the description of the video. And now let's begin. As you can see, our raw file is rather dark with a little bit of underexposure and a lot of contrast. So the very first thing we want to do is to head into the basic adjustments, and I want to change the profile right away, going from Adobe Color to Adobe Landscape to push the saturation a bit. And you can also see this profile helps making the very dark parts of the image a little brighter, and this in turn helps with the soft look we are aiming for. Now we can also adjust the white balance a little bit. I do have the feeling this shot is a little bit warm, so I'm going to drop the temperature very slightly, introducing some more coldness to the shot. I'm not going to touch the tint, but what I want to do next is work on the exposure. So I want this whole image to be a little brighter, especially in the darker areas. The first step to do that is to bring up the exposure overall just a little bit. As we bring up the exposure, we will lose details in those bright areas of the waterfall, but don't worry about that. We can restore them by bringing down the highlights all the way. And this will reveal all this fine detail in the white water. That looks perfect. Now to further work on the soft look, we want to further brighten up the dark areas. To do that, we can bring up the shadows a little bit. And we can also raise the blacks. These adjustments will lessen the contrast more and more. And less contrast helps create the soft effect. But of course we don't want to lose all the contrast. We want to have areas with more and areas with less contrast. But more on that later with the masking adjustments. For now, what I want to do next, I want to add a little bit of texture, which will make this shot a little sharper. And then I'm going to bring down the clarity, and I'm going to bring down the dehaze quite a bit. And what this does is it will apply a very soft effect on top of the image. And at this point it almost looks like an autumn glow effect. So that's great. Now we don't need to adjust vibrance or saturation since the base image is already quite vibrant at this point. We want to head into the masking panel and target a few areas more specifically. The first area that comes to mind is the whitewater of the waterfalls. Right now it doesn't really look good. It actually lacks a lot of detail, and this area needs more contrast in order to make the water look more interesting. So we can target that area pretty easily by choosing a color range mask, and with the eyedropper of the color range mask I'm just clicking right here in the white water. Since these areas consist mostly of blue color tones, we can nicely target them all. However, we want to further adjust this mask. So what I want to do is to say subtract, and I'm simply going to choose a brush. I don't want to target the waterfall in the far back right here. And of course there are a few trees and other things selected as well. So I'm just going to erase them from this mask by painting over them with the brush. This is looking like a proper selection. Now what we can do is we want to head down to the effects, and we want to bring up texture and clarity a lot. So we get way finer details in these areas, and we can really raise texture and clarity a lot, as you can see, since we're only targeting those very bright areas. Okay, and with just these two changes, the waterfall and the whitewater look much better, as you can see. But we can further tweak it. We can slightly bring down the shadows to push the contrast. We can also bring up the whites, further increasing the contrast. And what I like to do for waterfall images like this is to just add a little bit of a blue tint to the white water, because I think it looks good. However, if you don't like it, you don't have to do it, obviously. So let me bring down the temperature here, making these waterfalls a little more bluish. Then let me create a linear gradient, and I want to cover the top like this. I want to introduce some more contrast and softness in the top area without affecting the waterfall. So I'm going to say subtract, and I'm going to choose a color range mask. Again, just clicking right here in the waterfall. and that will give us a perfect selection. Now I also want to subtract a radial gradient right here, because this is a very bright spot where natural light is coming down from the top. And I want to keep that bright spot rather bright. So that's the reason for me to remove this from that mask. And what I want to do now is to bring down the exposure to make this part darker. Right around here looks good. And I also want to drop the dehaze. And I'm also going to drop the clarity very slightly, just to make the distance softer than the foreground. So that looks great already. By the way, I again forgot to collapse the film strip down here. That's something I just don't notice, so I'm sorry for that. Now we have the bigger image. Okay, back to the masking adjustments. What I want to do next is to further work on the bright spot up here. So I'm going to create a radial gradient, and I'm creating a rather big one like this. I'm going to place the center outside of the image right on top of this bright spot, and I want to make it brighter. So I'm going to increase the exposure. That's a bit too much. Let's bring it down. And I also want to increase the softness in this area, kind of adding some glow effect. So I'm going to bring up the blacks for that. And I'm also again slightly dropping the dehaze. Perfect. Maybe let's place it a little further up like this. And then we could dodge the green highlights in the foreground. For that, let me create another color range mask. And we want to target this spot right here. We could adjust the refine slider, bringing it up slightly so there are more green tones selected. Now I only want to target those mossy areas in the foreground and a little bit on the left side. So let me subtract a linear gradient, taking out pretty much all of the right side. I actually want to subtract the brush and getting rid of a few things like the trees right here. And with this selection, I want to slightly bring up the exposure, and this will just make those green color tones brighter, and thus we are dodging them. Perfect. Now I also want to use a linear gradient covering the bottom part of the image, just like this, pretty much the foreground. And I want to further introduce contrast by bringing down the shadows. Let's go with something like this. That looks great. And we can also bring up the clarity to just add some more punch to the area. Just a bit like this. Wonderful. At this point, I think the waterfall on the left side in the back looks a little bit too dark. So I want to create a radial gradient roughly covering this waterfall. And in here, I'm going to bring up the whites. This will help make it a little more visible, so we're getting back a very important area of the image. So not all attention is lost here. We could also play around with the clarity. I actually want to bring down the clarity in this case, making the waterfall in the distance look a little bit softer. That's quite the opposite of what we did in the beginning, but I think this just looks better this way. Okay, and finally, let me create one more radial gradient covering the white water in the foreground. Basically the top like this, and I want to introduce a little more brightness by bringing up the whites very, very gently. We don't want to overexpose anything, but this is looking great. And I guess that's the image after the masking adjustments. Let me show you the image with just some basic adjustments, and here we have it with the masking applied. So you can see there's a huge difference in contrast and detail. Now all that's left to do is a little bit of color grading. So let's head out of the masking panel, and we want to go into the color mixer. We can actually make use of the luminance sliders, dodging the image a little more by bringing up the green luminance. What this does is it will basically make all the green color tones of the image brighter, and this looks really good, adding some more punch to the image. Now we can also go into the saturation tab. What I personally love doing for these kind of images is to bring down the yellow saturation, which will give us a more cleaner looking green color tone, if that makes sense. Because the yellow saturation makes the image kind of look dirty in my opinion. So by reducing it, we are kind of cleaning up the green color tones. We can further boost this effect now by bringing up the green saturation a bit. And that looks awesome. Now, if you want to add more color to the water, what I love to do for that is to just slightly bring up the blue saturation to increase the blue tint in the white water. Just like that. And I guess that's pretty much it for the color mixer. I guess we could take a look in the calibration tab and just slightly bring up the blue primary saturation a bit. Alright, now all that's left to do is some sharpening in the details tab, and I'm applying the same settings every time. I'm dropping the radius, I'm increasing the details, I'm adding masking while holding down the Alt key so we can see where the sharpening is applied, and I'm increasing the amount of sharpening. Done. Now there are a few sensor spots which we can clean up, so let's click on remove. And we want to choose the heel brush, and we want to click on visualize spots. For this image, we might want to bring down that slider so those spots are easier to find, and let's just brush over them. Actually, I might want to deactivate this setting. Okay, but I think it looks clean now. So that's it for editing a soft, dreamy waterfall image like this. I hope this Lightroom tutorial was interesting and helpful. If you have anything to add or have any questions left, feel free to ask or write in the comments. And thank you so much for watching this video.